have the honor of introducing Professor Yezid Sayigh. Sayigh is a senior associate at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, and currently his work focuses on the Syrian crisis, the political role of Arab armies, security sector transformation in Arab transitions, the reinvention of authoritarianism, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and peace processes. Before he assumed his current position, Professor Sayigh was professor of Middle Eastern Studies at King's College in London. And from 1994 to 2003, he served as Assistant Director of Studies at Center for International Studies at Cambridge. Many of you know Sayigh's book, Struggle and the Search for State. It's a huge volume, 900 pages. It was a famous bestseller when it came out in 1997. It's really the standard classical work on the history of the PLO. And for those of you who haven't read it yet, you should just start and commit a year of your lifetime to study that. Sayigh has also studied, written other work. One of his most recent works is the Syrian opposition's leadership problem in 2013, Above the State, the Officers' Republic in Egypt, and also he has written on Palestinian policing, Hamas policing Gaza, and also policing people, building the state and authoritarian transformation in West Bank and Gaza in 2011. So without any further ado, please, Yezid.
Thanks. I'm very grateful to Dr. Leah for the introduction and the invitation to the university, and thankful to you all for coming here. I've been here less than 24 hours, and I already see several familiar faces among you, people I was speaking to yesterday about a very different subject. So it'll be interesting what sort of discussion we have today. And I would like a discussion. I will probably speak for too long anyway, but this is something that's more of a reflection on what's been happening in Syria rather than an attempt to do a current affairs analysis. I'm not going to tell you where the situation is now, what will happen next. We might discuss that later over once the formal session is ended. But really this draws on my attempt to think through the nature of the Syrian revolutionary process. Is this a revolution? What do we mean by revolution? If you try and get definitions from the social science literature, you'll find there's actually not much agreement on what constitutes a revolution. How do we know that what has happened here or there is a revolution? And that is something I've discussed and thought about as well in the past. I won't get into that discussion here. I'm not going to try and determine whether what is happening in Syria or has happened is or has been at any phase a revolution. Rather, I'm just going to look at some aspects of the oppositional phenomenon, let's say, in Syria, of how the opposition has unfolded and acted. And I'm terming that a revolutionary process because I also want to compare with the Palestinian case. And why with the Palestinian case is also, I think, something I need to explain. It's maybe, well, I need to explain this partly because in some respects you might say that Syria is much closer, in a sense, or comparable to what happened in Iran in the late 1970s, which led to what was certainly a revolution in 1978-79. And that was an instance really of significant socio-economic change within a short period of time, roughly from the early 1960s, mid-1960s, the White Revolution under the Shah, the rise of oil prices, therefore increasing his revenue, enabling him to launch the so-called White Revolution, which was meant to modernize agriculture, modernize social relations, etc. And then with the second major price increase in oil in 1973-74, the Shah was able to launch a much more ambitious and accelerated process of urbanization, industrialization, infrastructure construction, etc., which led to massive rural migration to the cities, disappointed expectations, dislocations of all kinds that coincided with other things such as the rise of a middle class that was increasingly offered consumption and trappings of modern society, but at the same time none of the political voice or power. And all this came together finally in a whole mixture of different forces and agendas, and resulted in 78, 79, a people's uprising against the Shah that finally overthrew him, and then after more struggles consolidated around a specific Islamist core as opposed to all the other possible outcomes. In that sense, what's happened in Syria is somewhat similar to what happened in Iran, in that massive social or socioeconomic transformations, especially in the last 20 years, but even more so in the last decade before the uprising, had pushed hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of people around the country, especially from the eastern parts towards the main cities. The poverty belts that built up around Damascus or Aleppo mushroomed in just 6 years as a result of drought in the east, of overuse of the water aquifer, pushing people off the land, all sorts of things that were happening. And there too, there's this massive rural-urban shift. We see that in the nature of the rebellion today, that much of the armed rebellion, if not entirely, is a rural-urban or urbanized rural phenomenon in a sociological sense. So I'm in a way making the argument for looking at Syria in a way, comparing it with Iran, but I'm going to use Palestine because I'm interested in the forms in which revolutionary movements or oppositional movements in Syria, the forms they took, the modes of action, how they've organized, mobilized, why they militarized, what military action or armed struggle has meant to them. Why have they also been so fragmented and disunited? Why have they been so leaderless? Brynjar kindly referred to the paper I brought out last year on the opposition's leadership problem. And so this, I think, is where the Palestinian case is very interesting and pertinent. Another thing there I'd like to add, and this, in a way, I'm already sort of dealing with substantive issues, as you'll see, I hope, in a little while, that for me, since I grew up in Lebanon and I experienced the Palestinian movement and Syrian intervention and involvement in Lebanese politics and Syrian politics and, of course, Jordanian politics over decades. So there's this very close interlinking between Syria under the Ba'ath, in particular under the Assad regime, but even well before, and the Palestine issue and its neighbors. So this has always been there. Many Syrians were involved in PLO movements, in Fatah or the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front. People like Sadiq Jalal Azm, for instance, was a major sort of theorist on the left. Burhan Ghalioun, who later became chairman of the Syrian National Council, was also affiliated at one point. There are many like them. And of course there are 500,000 Palestinian refugees in Syria who were allowed a bit of autonomy, unlike the rest of the Syrian population, to engage in organized political activity under autonomous organizations that weren't simply subservient to the Syrian regime or the Ba'ath Party or Syrian intelligence. And so despite all this, what's always struck me as I followed opposition media, activists, etc., is how extremely rare any reference is to the Palestinian experience, to revolutionary experience of organizing, of preparing to fight, of preparing for sieges, of anything you can think of. And I was struck time and time and time again because for many years, let's say when the PLO was still powerful in Lebanon up to 1982, the Israeli invasion, and the PLO learned over time how to prepare on the military front, how to defend Beirut, for instance, during summer 1982 for 2 months against an Israeli siege, how immediately they set up supply centers, bakeries, they dug wells for water, they provided fuel depots for power generators to run field clinics, etc. And all this was done within a few days while they held the Israelis at bay at the southern entrance to the capital, and in that time they transformed the city. Whereas the Syrian opposition, a year and a half after the first refugee flows, the Syrian National Council, as it was called then, still hadn't set up a single office in southeast Turkey to start coordinating aid and relief for refugees or to provide diesel shipments, gas oil, fuel, into, say, Aleppo or Idlib to help run generators, to help run communications, to help run hospitals, to help provide heating, to help provide cooking, to help provide anything. I mean, the sort of the most obvious thing that might occur to someone coming from Lebanon who'd experienced this hadn't occurred to these people a year and a half later. And I kept getting struck by all this. Now, my purpose isn't to be critical. It's simply to try and use this sort of contrast to say, so why and why not and what's going on? And one answer I've been given by Syrian activists to try and explain why they haven't looked is interesting. One is that, well, the Palestinian experience finally ended up in failure, so it's not really an encouraging model to follow. And that's one angle, and I think that's a legitimate angle. Another is social, if you like, social status, that in Syria, Palestinians are guests, they're welcome, they've been supported in many, many very positive ways, but they're still regarded as losers or as, refugees, as inferior socially. So many Syrian activists, including middle-class activists, there's a sort of subtle, unspoken sense that what do we have to learn from these people? And the same attitude towards the Lebanese, which is interesting. The Lebanese are often very racist towards Syrians, and a lot of their experience with Syrians is of migrant workers. But at the same time, Syrians, and especially sort of the established middle class, look down on the Lebanese and regard them as inferior, and they don't know how to run their country, and look at us, we know how to run things. And I'm mentioning this simply to say how interesting it is, how we all tend, even when we're very closely we occupy, if not the same space, very intermingled spaces, how easy it is to work within our set sort of socio-cultural space, as it were, and not see or recognize or acknowledge people who are actually occupying a very similar space, and how the politics of that work. And it seems to me something maybe not so surprising when you see cities where the rich can live in high-rises and the poor live just a step away in slums, and they all occupy very different spaces from day to day. The Israelis have been doing that with their Palestinian population for many years, for instance. And I think it's useful to bring that background in. Now, so what I will do in terms of a very specific and direct comparison between the Palestinian and Syrian case, I'm not going to do anything systematic, but I do want to touch on three main areas or three main factors, which are leadership, organization, and expectations or perceptions. And I'll clarify as I go along. I'm focusing clearly at this point on agency, to use social science terms, rather than structure. I mean, rather than talk about socioeconomic patterns or regional politics or international relations, I'm going to focus on how the individuals engaged in these processes or affected directly by these processes, how they see the process, how they engage in it, what they put into it. So I'm particularly interested in that. So on leadership first, I think the contrast or comparison between the Palestinian and Syrian cases needs to ask the question of how does leadership emerge? How do you acquire leadership? How do you become a leader? And that's interesting partly because clearly in the Syrian case there's been such a failure or a lack or a weakness of leadership. Or maybe you could say there have been too many leaders, but mostly at grassroots level, and very few at a sort of national level. The Syrian opposition structure, the Syrian National Council, which was then succeeded by the Syrian National Coalition, which is recognized by a great many governments around the world as the sole legitimate representative of the Syrian people. This structure has remained very much a top-level structure, disunited, dysfunctional, unable to acquire genuine legitimacy and credibility among its own people inside Syria. It had that initial support, but then it failed to deliver. And so why this leadership was able to emerge, it received recognition, but then it went nowhere with that. And at the same time, you have a lot of people on the ground in Syria, whether the people who are armed and conduct military action or who run civilian administration, provide humanitarian relief, provide healthcare in Aleppo, in Daraa, and the eastern Ghouta around Damascus, all these areas which have had to learn how to provide their own needs. And to my mind, these are the true leaders. And they should have been the people who at some point acquire sufficient experience and maturity and confidence to say, no, you, the leadership sitting in Istanbul, what you've just declared, or, when you talk about having a Western intervention, we know that's not going to happen. Your agenda is wrong. That's not the political agenda. We should be doing X or Y or Z. I assume that that would emerge gradually as a natural, organic process as people on the ground gained experience and then extended and sort of standardized or replicated that experience in other locations around Syria and liberated areas, and eventually created a genuine leadership. Ideally, the leadership outside Syria should have been working from day one to help generate that kind of leadership and to, if not delegate, then at least to acknowledge and encourage the transfer of the real center of leadership or center of gravity of the revolution, the uprising, to inside Syria rather than outside in exile. That hasn't happened, and it may be a failing that will cost this uprising, revolution, opposition, the conflict finally. The regime, I don't think, can win in the classical sense, but this opposition can lose. And what that means is that it gets finally overtaken by some other new kind of form of opposition that may be right now still difficult to predict. So, but in terms of a comparison, what more can I say? Well, I think the issue of representation and recognition is particularly interesting, because with the Palestinian case, although the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, was officially established in 1964 by the Arab states, it didn't gain sort of genuine grassroots legitimacy until after the 1967 war, when Israel occupied the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and a new, younger generation of activists like Yasser Arafat, Benyan, George Habash, and others, all dead now, took over the PLO structure and gave it a new type of authenticity and a new type of energy. So it transformed into something that had massive legitimacy to its own public, its own domestic, i.e. Palestinian audience. And from there on, when it acquired recognition over the 1970s, first from the Arab states in 1973, renewed recognition as the sole legitimate representative, then from the non-aligned movement, 77 nations, then from the Soviet bloc and other socialist countries, China, Vietnam, Cuba, etc., and then increasingly by some, at least Western European countries, Austria, Portugal, Spain, after their own liberation from dictatorship. So there was a process in which the PLO had first acquired and demonstrated its domestic authority, if you like, that it was on the ground, it had genuine acceptance by its own people who mobilized under it and within its various structures. The Syrian experience, again, I'm not saying this is good or bad or right or wrong, I'm just saying that in the Syrian case, the leadership structure that emerged immediately was awarded recognition long before it had demonstrated anything or gained that sort of, demonstrated its credibility, its ability to actually provide leadership. And what it did instead was to plead with those who had recognized it for the political and material, military, financial means with which to demonstrate its credibility and relevance to its own people. So this became a sort of donor-funded process in which acquiring political assets and credibility among the people depended on what the outsiders were going to do to help this leadership, rather than the other way around. And this is really relevant, I think, because ironically the people who didn't follow this logic and who followed a very different logic were mainly the Salafist and in some cases jihadist groups in Syria, like Jabhat al-Nusra or the Islamic State or Ahrar al-Sham, which is still not, Al-Qaeda, but close. Some of the other brigades, all Salafist, which didn't sit around waiting for guns and money and so on from Western governments or others. Some of them benefited from private donations from the Gulf, it's true. But the point is, they immediately started trying to do something on the ground. Some of the groups that were first aware of the need to construct civilian administration to provide services in a systematic, routinized way in local liberated areas were again the Salafist groups. The first people to do this, for instance, were Ahrar al-Sham, Jabhat al-Nusra, not the so-called moderate opposition. So it's interesting to see how this dynamic operated, and sadly, for this so-called moderate or secular or whatever opposition, recognition became a liability because their primary interest was how to acquire recognition and then keep it, and they were afraid of any initiatives or any policy statements or an initiative such as setting up an interim government in exile to undertake civil administration in liberated areas, which they then feared would take legitimacy away from them and become the representative of the Syrian uprising. So the need to keep that recognition then became a negative factor rather than a positive one. There's a point I want to make also about the sort of the sociological profile, if you like, of the leadership, but I'm going to leave that for a moment because I want to come back to it in what I'm discussing next, which is organization. Now, by organization, well, partly I mean structures and networks. I also mean skills, administrative capability. But I also mean learning. In other words, how any group of people, self-formed or whatever, how they set up an objective, they identify a priority, and then as they go along, they assess whether the means they've developed are effective or not. And then learn from that and keep adapting and evolving and so on. And that I think is interesting because if you look at an organization like Hezbollah, clearly that is a learning organization. It is one which made learning a central part of its mode of operation. You read memoirs and statements and so on by people like Sheikh Naim Qasim, who's the Deputy Secretary General, describing how they fought Israel back in 90s and up to 2000 in the south of Lebanon. And he, it's very clear, it's very explicit that we would do something, we would plan it in a certain way, we'd do our homework, and then we'd observe the results, we'd study them carefully, we'd apply, draw the lessons, and then apply them, and we'd train and train and train and train. And they did that partly because, among other things, the value of their members' lives was important. They didn't want to throw 100 people at a target and lose 90 of them when they could throw 15 and lose one. It really mattered to them. So these things were important. So the learning process reflected how serious they were, how much value they attached to certain things, such as preserving their members' lives. It gave them the ability to control battlefield management, or there are a number of things. I don't want to get too much into that, but I'm simply saying that when I contrast the Palestinian and Syrian cases, there too some obvious differences arise. In the Palestinian case, one of the critical factors that enabled the PLO and enabled the revolutionary generation that took it over in the 60s, as I mentioned earlier, was that already after 1948, when most of these people became exiles from their homes in what was Palestine, during the 1950s, a lot of them joined different Arab political parties, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Communists, Arab Nationalist Movement. Others formed separate groups or gangs. A lot of them, the key members, the key figures like Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas, who's now the Palestinian Authority president, and others, joined or formed the Palestinian Students' Union. Others, the General Union of Palestinian Women, of Palestinian Engineers. There's a whole range of social associations which emerged in this period when there was no clear national political leadership. But by forming these unions or associations, which extended to wherever Palestinians were, there were chapters in Germany and Spain and Austria and much of Europe, for instance, the networks were established so that these people knew each other. The methods of organization, mobilization, PR campaigns, of how to convene a meeting, Robert's rules of procedure, for instance. Almost all these people actually knew how to run a meeting and set an agenda. I mean, it's quite interesting if you think about it. And it meant that there was a relatively high level of grassroots networking and mobilization and experience. So that by the time these people took over the PLO, they had something like at least 10 or 12 years of experience behind them of how to do this. And they brought that to the PLO and then expanded it from their position of controlling the PLO structure and budget and legitimate representation with official diplomatic offices in Arab capitals to invite more people to join these unions and use the unions as sort of mobilizing arms or agents. In the Syrian case, the Assad regime clearly for decades has dominated all associational life, either by banning any life outside of the Ba'ath Party framework, or in other cases forming mass unions of peasants or farmers, of workers, of all the different social sectors, all of which were, however, centrally tied to the state and regulated by it and monitored by it. So these became means not so much of mobilization as of co-optation and containment. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to mean that no one acquired any skills, but clearly there was no such thing as an autonomous associational life in Syria, especially in the last 20 years, that activists could learn political skills through. Which is not to say that there were no political skills. I've met activists, for instance, who actually had acquired some experience by joining the legal political parties, or in some cases illegal ones. The Syrian National Socialist Party, the faction of Assad Hardan, which is in alliance with the Assad regime. But before the uprising, many young activists who didn't want to be part of the Ba'ath could join the SSNP, for instance, instead, legally, without having to worry about getting arrested. And that did give them contacts and networks and skills. Others maybe joined the illegal branch of the Communist Party, Faisal Yusuf, let's say, or even the legal branch, and then eventually moved on. But still, these were a very small number of middle-class activists compared to the mass of Syrians who just weren't part of any formal association. And in the last 10 or 15 years, with liberalization, neoliberal policies, mass migration, the number of Syrians who work in Lebanon, Jordan, the Gulf, i.e. outside Syria, or in Syria but away from their original homes, is very high. And that can mean both a transmission of ideas and examples and revolutionary ideas or models, but it also can mean a high level of dislocation, which tends to be an impediment as well. So it can work both ways. I'm going to say a word more about that later when I come to expectations and perceptions, but here I just want to emphasize the importance of the basic technical skill of setting up an organized structure and acquiring these procedures and experiences. In the Palestinian case, when an uprising happened, you'll recall maybe or heard about the first Intifada in 1987 onwards in the occupied territories. That occurred, what was impressive about it, not only was its civilian, fundamentally peaceful or unarmed character, but that it happened very rapidly. It spread from one or two locations, and within days it spread throughout the occupied territories. Now, part of that was what you might call a structural factor, that the realities of occupation since 1967 for 20 years, the pressure on land, how labor was treated, all these different things were affecting everyone. And so there was a general potential throughout the population. But in terms of organization, what had also happened in the meantime was that thanks partly to Arab aid, partly to Jordanian policy, but certainly partly to the PLO itself, sometimes working with the others like the Jordanians after they sort of made up in 1978-9 when they started funding projects together in the occupied territories anyway. A whole set of social associations and economic associations were formed, housing cooperatives, 4 new universities in the West Bank and Gaza, new printing presses and newspapers. All these things were forming new forms of social organization for, education, for healthcare, for the media, all these normal things. But they were being done autonomously from the Israelis, not dependent on Israeli government funding, and that ultimately gave a lot of autonomy, experience, and so on, and it created the networks again. Coupled with the presence of these active PLO factions that were, again, rebuilding their student unions, their women's associations on the ground, so that by 1987, even though the PLO hadn't planned the uprising, once it started, the PLO structure could move immediately into action. And within a week or so, in every main town, and certainly in every city or neighborhood, you had a unified national leadership of the uprising committee. And they all followed the same standard model where Fatah and the PFLP and so on were represented. Hamas set up its own. It refused to join. But the point is that the organizational structure was there for a quick response and a standardized response, but also, interestingly, one which gave a lot of autonomy and power to the local grassroots leadership. And the thing I said right at the start about who sets the agenda, who becomes leadership, is interesting because in the first Intifada in Palestine, within weeks, this local leadership, which had been legitimized and appointed, or at least legitimized basically by the PLO leadership sitting in Tunis, but it had a lot of genuine substance and autonomy. And by January 1988, in other words, within a month, 5-6 weeks, this local leadership had drafted what it proposed as the new political strategy of the PLO and sent it to Tunis for approval, which was adopted by the Palestine National Council, and then became the substance of Arafat's speech at the UN and finally in Geneva at the end of the year, recognizing Israel, adopting a two-state solution, accepting UN Security Council resolutions on the matter. And the push for this came from inside. And that, I think, is an example of a healthy relationship between the Sayigh leadership and the local leadership, and demonstrates what I was saying about how leadership is created and how it then becomes a political leadership, not just a set of administrators who are told, you can go provide services, which is how the current Syrian leadership opposition deals with the local councils inside Syria. They treat them purely as administrative apparatuses and not as political leaders. And I think that's a critical difference. Now, here's where I want to go back to the point I said I was going to come to this about the sociology of leadership. This is a slightly, I don't know, it's not exactly mischievous, but I often think that the Syrian opposition's leadership, the recognized one of the National Coalition, wonderful people who had the courage in the 1990s or early 2000s to be living in Syria and to stand up and call for reform, to be dissidents, basically, and sometimes to go to prison for that. So very impressive people on that individual level. But it's like, I always compare this to Václav Havel and his forum in what then was Czechoslovakia, when Gorbachev sort of basically lifted Soviet containment of East Europe and allowed the Velvet Revolution to start. In Czechoslovakia, the ruling Communist Party was very willing to have a peaceful transition and basically to hand over power. And it didn't require a fight. What's happened in Syria is people like Václav Havel, intellectuals, dentists, doctors, businessmen, very wonderful people. But they weren't facing the Czechoslovak Communist Party in 1989, they were facing the Assad regime and its whole history of massive coercion and use of violence on a big scale, torture, etc. And this was a regime that, unlike the Czechoslovak Communist Party, was not willing to hand over power peacefully or unpeacefully. And in a way, this leadership, the equivalent of it in the Palestinian case, was the leadership that formed the PLO in 1964. Middle class, the leftover sort of middle class or upper middle class elite from Palestine pre-1948, people like Ahmad Shuqairi, who'd been a lawyer, Abdullah Hamouda and others, who in 1949 tried to negotiate at Lausanne with the Israelis and others representing the refugees. This is something that we were discussing last night over dinner with someone who can speak more about this. But what's interesting is that these were people who weren't part of the old aristocratic elite of Palestine. They were part of the sort of more modern elite of Palestine, but pre-48. But they were still somewhat old-style and elitist in their politics and their approach. So when they helped form the PLO and became its leaders, they didn't then do anything revolutionary with it. And it took a new generation to come in, people like Arafat and others, who were from much more modest class backgrounds, and in many cases refugees, and therefore of somewhat inferior status. And they are the people who revolutionized and transformed what the PLO was all about. So in the Syrian case, we have what is in many ways a social revolution going on the ground. I mean, this is rural against urban, this is class, this is generational revolution. And yet the top leadership hasn't been swept away by events or by the new generation. It's a very, again, I'm not saying this to condemn anyone, I'm just pointing out these interesting contrasts, and that's why I've used the Palestinian case for that contrast. So let me say a few things about expectations and perceptions. And here's where I sort of go back a little bit to the wider context of how people's expectations are shaped. Let me put it in the simplest way. would the Syrian uprising have happened in March 2011 had the uprisings of Tunisia, Egypt and Libya not already happened? Had Ben Ali and Mubarak not been overthrown already and Muammar Gaddafi looked like he was losing Libya, had all that not already happened, would the Syrian uprising have happened at all at that time? The conditions, the socioeconomic conditions, the decline of the state, of its legitimacy, of its services, etc., these were all processes that had been happening for 20 years or so. And they were likely to blow up at some point. Maybe not in that form at all. But the fact is that the uprising happened at that time, and it happened in a particular context. So already I'm establishing that context is really important. The timing is important. Because it gave people the idea of people power, if you like, of a mass, popular, unarmed uprising being enough to bring down tyrants. Now, whether that was realistic vis-a-vis the Assad regime, unlike the Egyptian or Tunisian or the others, is another matter. But the expectation was clearly very important. But what I want to do is say a little bit more about what came next in the way of revolutionary formation, i.e. the formation of more organized modes of action, resistance, etc. In Syria, in the urban centers in particular, educated activists formed what were known as the local coordination committees, Tansiqiyat, and other similar, the General Commission for the Syrian Revolution, and a whole range of unarmed activist-based organizations that did a tremendous job, very creative stuff. They used also social media, and they were fundamentally unarmed. And some of them were resolutely opposed to the militarization of the uprising. Others, like the General Commission, joined it or actively supported it. But that was one aspect of form. Others, quite early on, moved to guns, especially in areas like Douma, the poverty belt, rural migrants, etc. And they developed different kinds of forms, often more based on the mosque or on Salafist networks, people who come out of jail. That's another form of organization, building on their legacies and their experiences and their networks. So a whole variety, that's fine. But what I'm trying to get at here is, what sort of ideas of revolution did these people look to? What did they think they were doing? I mean, this, for the anthropologists among you, would be interesting, I guess, is what did they understand? What was their understanding of what they were doing? What did the word revolution mean for them? What did any of these things mean for them? So that's something I'm interested in. And here, again, the context of Palestinians is interesting, because when the PLO leadership emerged in the mid-60s and then the new generation took over, 67 and onwards, their discourse was drawn directly from what had happened in the previous decade in Cuba. So you had the idea of the guerrilla foco, the revolutionary focal sort of core. You had the Chinese Cultural Revolution and everything that brought with it. You had Algeria, of course, which became independent in '62 after a pretty brutal war against the French. Vietnam. All these were the experiences within which the PLO positioned itself, and its reference was people's war, guerrilla war, and its terminology, its ideas were all drawn from this wider context, and the literature showed this in every possible way. And that's very much what my book covered, that Dr. Elia mentioned at the start. But the context today is clearly very different. It's not about China, Vietnam, and for some people it's about Western notions of free individuals being masters of their own fate. So you get middle-class activists, unarmed, who believe in the power of things like social media, of networking, of non-organization, all these different things that seem to work in Midan al-Tahrir in Cairo, or in Tunisia, in Bourguiba Square, Yasmin, etc. And there were people in Syria who thought they were part of this world, and they are in a sense. But then many others, and they become very powerful through the armed struggle, look to Salafism. Now here I want to avoid being deterministic in any way, but certainly the fact that many of this particular sector had a very strong rural background, they were still rural or very recent rural migrants, so they were in a sense socially more conservative, they were already in the informal sector, most of them had moved out of the formal economy, so they subsisted and survived on different kinds of solidarity networks, migration networks, smuggling networks, informal economy, which doesn't mean they're all poor, but it just did mean that their survival strategies and their solidarity networks were fundamentally different. Also, the experience of large-scale migration over the previous 35 years, especially to the Gulf, meant that a great many Syrians had been influenced, and many had gone to school in the Gulf, and were influenced by the Salafism or Salafist ideas that were inculcated through religious education in the Gulf. And this is something that leading rebel commanders have told me. One who said, I'm not a Salafist, but I'm very close, and the reason why I am is that I grew up in the Emirates, and I mean, I'm not saying he's right or wrong, I'm just saying that the way he put it was, I can assure you that not a single Salafist, there's not a Salafist in Syria in the armed rebellion today who didn't grow up in the Gulf or didn't go through that experience. Now, whether that's strictly accurate or not, I can't say. But the point is that that is the reference. It's no longer Che Guevara or the Algerian independence war even. It's a whole new framework, discursive, sociocultural, political, of rebellion, resistance, revolution, of defiance to tyranny, whether it's Assad or Saddam, whether it's the Americans or the Israelis. And that's why this is so powerful. And I think that's also why Syria has had an impact around Muslim communities in particular, and sometimes not even Muslim ones, in terms of people who go to fight in Syria, or especially now people who go to join the Islamic State, who see in this a reference they recognize, one that is outside the entire system of elites, corrupt elites in Egypt or Syria or Tunisia working with this Western neoliberal economic order that has so disadvantaged them in their lives and marginalized them in their lives all across the Arab world. We could say a lot more about that in discussion if you'd like, but I need to wrap up. And so what I want to, I'll sort of pull this issue of expectation and perceptions, I'll tie all this together with a couple of remarks to finish. One thing is that revolution and change of this dramatic nature is very much a matter of timing. I mean, it not only occurs at one historical moment and not another for reasons, some of which are structural, but also if the opportunity is not seized effectively, you miss the bus. And it may be that the Syrian uprising / revolution had a potential for achieving certain things in its first year, maybe 2 years. It may be that it's missed that window of opportunity. And now what we have is a grinding, endless military struggle in which neither side really can win, and all they can do is destroy more. I mean, to end up in something that can't be rebuilt in any obvious way anymore, until something totally different happens. And that might not be possible until there is defeat right now for one side or the other, and that's probably not going to be the regime. But I just want to emphasize that, as the Palestinians found as well, there were moments when they could achieve certain things, maybe around the time of Camp David, the Sadat peace initiative towards Israel at the end of the 70s, and then the same again in Oslo, the Oslo Accords. And the final point otherwise is to go back to the sociological aspect, which is that although the Palestinian case is about liberation from occupation, but it too follows natural social fault lines. The people who get engaged and why they get engaged, and whether they get engaged through Islamism or jihadism, Hamas-style Islamism or secularism, left secularism or right-wing secularism, refugee exile politics or the politics of people sitting on their land inside Palestine, these social dimensions and fault lines were actually very important in determining the course of the Palestinian revolutionary experience and its forms. And I think that is underestimated a lot of the time. And when you look at it that way, the Syrian revolutionary experience has done exactly the same thing. I'm going to stop there since I'm now a minute late, and we can follow that up in discussion.